I want to talk about the difference between imperialism and nationalism in the effort of finding a synthesis between these two dominant modes and approaches to international politics. And the goal of striving for this synthesis is to chart a plausible and worthwhile course for Western civilization. Because Western civilization needs a new model right now. The liberal post World War I concert of nations system, which has subsequently, through the 20th century, been hijacked and incorporated into the American financial empire, trade empire, is now breaking down. And we're clearly seeing the end of the so called unipolar moment. And we're also seeing massive demographic transformations across the entire Western world. And with these changes, there comes with it a demand for self responsibility and self consciousness to emerge within the West. Um, so, of course, within within the wider dissonant right space, there's major debates going on between the idea of nationalism, the idea of imperialism, and how that this stacks up against the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. On one side, you have nationalists like Greg Johnson defending the Ukraine on the basis of its national sovereignty and right for self determination. Then you have others who side with Russia because of the structural forces that Russia and its allies in the BRICS bloc represent in contradistinction to the American imperial system, if you want to call it that. But the American empire is pretty well understood. And even if America isn't a true classical empire, it's certainly a type of postmodern empire. Okay. So we have some siding with Russia on the grounds of the strategic uh, and and structural forces that it represents, and then we have others siding in principle on the basis of the sovereign nation state, the ethno state, and that this represents the model to move forward. So if we're to accept that Russia represents a new model that is advantageous for us in the West, and that a Russian victory or a Russia China victory over the West would present Western people with a better course of action, with a better model, with a better plan than what we have now, then it could make sense to support these powers as many do. But quite frankly, I'm going to, without wasting more time, without rambling more and giving pretext, I'm going to say that we need to chart a new course that is neither pro American empire and EU as we understand it now, nor pro BRICS, but that the thing to advocate for is almost the mutual destruction and disintegration of both sides against one another through the strategic neutrality and realignment of the West that can be achieved through a general sense of intelligently directed populism, which means that through the continued development of counter elites and through online and alternative media and the great influence it is now able to exert, that we can begin to seed ideas that form the foundation of a new path out of the Atlantic Zionist American system, but also out of the Eurasian system that Russia is working to build as part of the wider BRICS bloc, i.e., multipolarity. And to understand this new position, the new front, so to speak, we need to get into the heart of the matter of nationalism and imperialism. So we could start by saying that there's a fact of nationalism as a legal entity, as a structural force, and then there is a spirit of nationalism, which something that appeals to the pathos, something that evokes a strong emotion, and of course, an organic collective identity. Could be cultural, racial, biological, linguistic, historical, hereditary. Any of these factors can contribute to a spirit of nationalism defined as a collective identity and an embodied collective identity. But first, we need to talk about the fact of nationalism as a structural force. And nationalism arose in the modern sense, first with the French Revolution. Of course, the American Revolution played a pretty decisive role in the history of nationalism. But the way we really think about it today emerged after the First World War and the Treaty of Paris, and the idea that nations and the right to self-determination by particular ethnic groups and peoples would become the basis of the world model of states. And this was maintained in distinction against the Bolshevik system, which sought to dissolve national borders in favor of an integrated communist project, and under the slogan "Workers of the World Unite." And of course, the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, accused the nationalists of effectively being propped up by capitalist interests, right? And the old argument that nationalism is a tool of capitalism, and that fascism is capitalism in decay, and the rest of it. So you have these two camps. But when we get down to the fact of the matter is that the sovereign nation state is operating as an element within a wider interconnected context that is underpinned by a form of imperialism, in this case, the soft imperialism and the financial imperialism of the United States. In other words, the liberal nation state is in many ways a vassal of the American empire. And this is an accusation that the Russian State Department and the enemies of the West in general would still levy against it. And this isn't wholly wrong. But what is most significant is to consider that a nation's sovereignty, which is presented to the liberal national model as some sort of inherent right, and that the rights of nations are equal in the eyes of international law, this is something that does not hold. It doesn't have real weight to it. Just like our individual rights don't really exist unless we have the means to defend them. In other words, sovereignty can only exist when there is the sufficient power, both in terms of military, cultural, and economic power, to in fact support it and protect it. Otherwise, it's in name only, and it's not real sovereignty. So when it comes to small states like the Baltic states or even a country like Austria, these small countries aren't true sovereign powers in real terms. Legally, they're recognized as sovereign powers, but if they were really to throw their weight around, it wouldn't work out so well for them. And the imperial structure that they function within and derive their rights from would come down on it. And you would find out pretty quickly about the real power or sovereignty of these countries. We can also look to the situation of the Third Reich in going into World War II, how it sought to develop a policy of autarky and independence and self sufficiency, but it came up against certain problems with fuel and energy and natural resources, which proved determinative to the conclusion of the Second World War. In other words, it needed the oil from the Caucasus or from the Gulf or from somewhere in order to truly remain a sovereign power. And of course, this was realized by the leadership. Without going into too much of a tangent here, the point remains that sovereignty depends on a certain degree of self-sufficiency and autarky. And as long as a state is dependent on the core resources it needs to survive, even if it is trading for those resources on its own terms, it doesn't have true sovereignty and security in the way that I'm using this word, which is not in legal terms, but in real terms. In real terms. And for this reason, we need to think seriously about the sovereignty question as being something that emerges from autarky, independence, self-sufficiency, and a cohesive culture as well within that element. If we think about this more, it becomes very important. If a nation, or perhaps it's not a nation, we have an empire that is multinational. So we have a multi-ethnic or multinational empire, such as Russia, or even as America today, where we have nations within a nation. The security and stability and the cohesion of that entity, of that state, will always be in question. It will always have to rely on internal forces at odds against one another, working against the interests of the state as a whole. There will always be resentments and frustrations baked into the cake. So if you look at the nation, the state, as the basic organizational entity of human society, a largely multinational empire will always be weaker than an empire or a state, an entity, a polity that is culturally unified. And so one of the biggest jobs of intelligence and the media is to create narratives and ideas that create the pretext for cultural unity. When you have great racial differences within your nation, achieving cultural unity is that much more difficult. But, potentially it's possible. I mean, if you look at the United States and maybe the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you have this narrative of cultural and racial equality and race-blind meritocracy and, the economy's great and Hollywood's great and everyone feels like they're at the top of the world. And maybe that worked for a time, but it's not sustainable because deeper cultural rifts and identities fragment when things get tough. In other words, when the money's flowing and things are good, sure, everyone can get along. But the minute the going gets tough, it's more than likely that different cultural or ethnic or racial groups are going to pull against one another. And that, of course, is also a threat to sovereignty. And this is certainly something that threatens Putin's Russia today. It's no secret that many of Russia's so-called autonomous republics have been expressing the will and the sentiment to have referendums and to break away. This is happening in Kaliningrad or Königsberg, and it's happening in many of the Siberian territories. Of course, there was the Chechen Civil War, so I don't need to go on about this. But my point is, when we want to really consider sovereignty, there's an aspect that is, of course, political, like Schmittian sovereignty. And we have an aspect that's economic, which has to do with the real terms of organizing resources and technical processes to create a powerful economy. And then we have the cultural aspect, meaning that there needs to be some sort of agreement or implicit social contract that substantiates the power of the state. So we have other factors that we could consider, and I'd like to go into on maybe another occasion, but we have these three factors that are part of sovereignty: the political, the economic, and the cultural. And they work together to form a stable basis of power that I would argue is not imposed, but it's actually dialectical, meaning it's going from top to bottom and bottom to top, and it's a constant conversation. And it's a structure, and it's a network that is communicating. And that's really what power and what sovereignty is. So that's a little bit more theoretical, and that could also be a good conversation for another time. But we want to stick to the matter of this new position, this new front, to help organize the West and to present an option to both people on the right and the left for what is in the interest of the West. And I've gone on to say that I don't think it's the liberal nationalist idea, the nation state, so to speak, because I would say that in real terms, those nation states, the nation state model is pretty much only propped up by American hegemony, which is crumbling. And of course, I don't think it would be advantageous for the West, from Europe, America, to Australia, to be run by Chinese or Russian proxies, rulers and regimes that are just puppets of China and Russia. I think that there's too much of a gap in terms of cultural values and thinking, and it would create a lot of pushback on a cultural level. And I also just don't think that their formula is quite right for the West. So the only option we're really left with is to create a hybrid between the idea of self-determination and nationalism with what Dugin calls, and I'm not a supporter of Dugin by any means, in fact, nor do I support Russia, but I think the model of fourth political theory in terms of the civilization state can be useful to us in redefining the West's role. And that's exactly what I will ultimately advocate. Of course, I don't think Europe should be part of Russia's Eurasian civilization state. No, it certainly isn't part of that. It doesn't follow in the legacy of Byzantium. It follows in the historical trajectory of Western Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. and so on and so forth. And for this reason, I believe that we need to move in towards an integrated pan-Western civilizational superstate or federation that is based on the respect for the various Western nations. Meaning there can be room for the internal organization of this new so-called empire or imperial state to satisfy the self-determination impulse and the autonomous impulse of different ethnic groups and Western nations within it, such as France, Italy, Germany, or America even, or certain aspects of America. But on the whole, it's just saying what already is. It's just pronouncing and formalizing what's already there, which is that our sovereignty is based on our collective cooperation, and it's formalizing that. And I think this very impulse is why we see such popularity in Europe today, for so many countries to join NATO and for Europe to integrate. And I personally think that the European right is really missing the mark by continuing to marry itself with petty nationalism rather than to see the opportunity in becoming the potential leaders of an integrated Europe, a federal Europe. And if only a real spirit of integrated Europe could be married with a true Europe first mindset, I believe that this could become the vehicle to effectively organize and lead the entire West in the, what should I say, in the age of the post-American empire, provided that America does indeed weaken or collapse. Of course, this is unlikely to happen very soon, and we could really talk about what this new Cold War between Russia, China, and the West really is going to look like. And that's not really the purpose of this conversation. So even if America remains a truly dominant power in the world for the next 30 years or 50 years, a stronger, united Europe would still act as a unifying power to sort of anchor the West. And I would argue that America, in fact, has been a great force of undermining Western civilization, culture, and Western nations as it's sort of imposed, not sort of, it has, directly imposed extreme multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, materialism and consumerism through the American brand and narrative, which of course is what justifies America's own internal identity. But that internal dialectic, if you will, its sovereign formula on a cultural level is being projected outward on all of its peripheral territories and especially onto Europe. And of course, this isn't working out so well for Europe, which is now suffering from extreme, migration and anti-cultural narratives that degrade Western civilization as the pretext and the necessary condition for the assimilation of the multiculturalism. So in this way, we could look at American foreign policy and cultural power as the very ferment of Western civilization. And it's bad for Americans, and it's very bad for Europeans. So what I'm recommending is a rebooted European Union that can be led by a new European right that gets its act together and overcomes the petty nationalist and fragmentary sentiments of the right and the new right in many respects, and aims towards leading an integrated federal Europe that has the chance to replace the Pax Americana and to create a new security umbrella an economic framework that can act as either a new pole in the multipolar world or a counterbalance to the power of China. And I personally see this integrated Europe as being the true counterbalance in the long term to China rather than the United States or Russia, because I believe that the United States and Russia are both undermined by too many domestic issues and from having fragmentary cultural identity and just straight up corruption and incompetence at the managerial level. And I believe that a Europe that is really based in honoring the nationalist spirit while integrating it into a wider civilizational, cultural, and racial identity of Europe will have tremendous cultural power and soft power that actually works against the interests of the United States and Russia simultaneously, because it will incite white Americans and ethnic Russians to sort of have a natural empathy and identification with this pan-European global project. And it will, and maybe even put wind in the sails of non-European nationalist groups within the Americas and within Russia. So as we open up this new front, we want to look at an imperial bloc, so to speak, or a federal bloc, but one that is based in a compatibility of its member states on a cultural and civilizational level. And let's be honest here, Italy and Germany, or Switzerland and Holland, have much more in common and are much more comfortable working together than Saudi Arabia and Germany, or even, of course, Turkey and Germany. We are different civilizations, we're very different people. There is a big difference between an empire that is made of compatible elements that could be thought of as an extended family that is working together and unifying for the mutual protection and benefit of all of the elements on a deep cultural level, compared to an empire that is a motley assortment of elements that don't really belong together or really have any business being together. And of course, that's exactly what the Eurasian project is. When you take ethnic Russians, which are effectively a Nordic breakaway or Slavic group, a fusion of the two, and you also have Turkic tribes and Mongol tribes, and you're bringing them all together into the same state and framework. There is resentment and dissidence that is built into that model. So I don't believe that that is a sustainable power formula. Conversely, I think China, because of its general cultural integration, and I don't mean any disrespect to the Uyghur or the Tibetans here, but ultimately there's a pretty high level of cohesion within, if you want to call it a Chinese nation or Chinese empire. I would actually think of it more as a Chinese empire, because China actually has many different ethnic groups and languages within it. I believe there's more languages spoken in China than there are in all of Europe. The great difference is that these different ethnicities didn't organize modern states prior to the formation of China. It would be as if Europe went straight from the Holy Roman Empire into a modern political system without the intermediary steps of the liberal nation-state order. And so I think we should take that as a reference and actually ask ourselves that exact question. What would that have been like? What if the Holy Roman Empire was a basic formula that has a deep rootedness that we could sort of build off of and extend into a new pan-Western civilizational project and federal system that could actually give us a real and meaningful framework moving into the future. And of course, the intermediary to access this, again, I'm restating, would be through NATO on a military level, through the EU and reforming the EU from the right, of course, but ultimately striving to work with the right and the left together to create an EU that truly represents European interests. And then finally, we have to look at how this will fit into the world to come and what's emerging as America seems to be becoming more and more unstable domestically and culturally. Its economic hegemony is, for the first time and really since World War II, is beginning to be threatened. It still has quite a lot of power, but the signs of decay are really setting in. And we have to start to think big. And I think part of the problem is we're so conditioned to thinking about what's right in front of us, what cards are on the table, what seems immediately tenable, and from the internet and from social media and whatnot, we're becoming so hyper reactionary. And I think what's needed is to take a step back, ask ourselves what really is fundamental. And of course, I'm going to argue that that's sovereignty, both in real terms and in perceived terms. And that sovereignty really depends on economic, political, and cultural forces coming together in a dialectical process that becomes the basis of that sovereignty. And that this is going to happen, or will most naturally happen, on the civilizational level for people who feel themselves to be and who are part of the European national system. And I think that whether you're a Frenchman, an Austrian, a Scandinavian, a Brit, an American, an Australian, we're all part of that framework. And the commitment has to be to Western culture, Western civilization, Western identity, and our ethnic identities that are built into this. And this creates a unique, I think, dividing line to stand on about what our future is really about. Are we going to allow ourselves to fall deeper and deeper into the misfortune of living in the results of the Allied victory of World War II, where we are living in these multicultural, technocratic empires? Or can we strive towards a new empire, a new type of true sovereign power that respects our national and cultural differences? So really, it's a marriage between the national and the imperial that I'm seeking. And I think that this really is the answer for the West. And it's more realistic than we think. So I know I've been rambling. I probably restated some of my points several times, but I will leave you with that to consider, and I can come back to this another time to expand. All right. Thank you.